So there's a long history in Puerto Rico of residents identifying themselves as white despite the fact that they have African roots. But now there's a major push to get more people to list themselves as black on the U.S. Census. On the census, more than 2/3 of Puerto Ricans on the island identify as white.
Organizers say the push to identify as black will help bring awareness to racial disparities impacting several communities on the island. Natasha Alford joins us now. She is the Vice President of Digital Content at the Grio. Natasha, I'm so happy that you're here to talk to us about your piece that you wrote earlier this week, because it was really fascinating, and you and I had communicated a little bit on social media about this. So break this down for our viewers. What are some of the reasons that you found Puerto Ricans choose to identify as white on the census?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. This story really tells the complexity of racial identity and cultural identity in Puerto Rico and really across the Caribbean. So, you know, we have this island that has this rich history of celebrating mixture, right? So a history of Taino heritage, European heritage, and African heritage. Yet for some reason, the majority of the island continues to identify as white. And some people consider this to be the vestige of colonialism. There was a time when there was privilege for being white, right? There was a policy known as gracias a sacar, where you could actually petition the Spanish Empire to be classified as white, because if you were black, that meant there were certain professions that you couldn't hold and opportunities that you couldn't have, very similar to the United States. And so this idea of social mobility through proximity to whiteness sees itself on the census. And I think there are many Puerto Ricans who feel that, you know, white and black just doesn't capture who they are. They don't think about race in the same way that we do in the United States. But there are also researchers who say that when census takers were going out in Puerto Rico, putting white was also a form of resistance. It was a form of rejecting that dichotomy of being forced to pick between white and black. And so it's really complex, the different reasons that people make that choice.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, you talked a little bit about some of the policies that reinforced or encouraged people to make that choice, and of course, sort of cultural issues. But even within the language, there are issues that reflect sort of the difference between black and white and ideas surrounding race.
Absolutely. When you think about how people identify on the island, you know, there are even terms where you may refer to somebody by the color of their skin or certain phenotypes or hair textures. And so think about an island where people say, you know, it's a utopia, it's a racial utopia. It doesn't matter what color you are, but people refer to you by the color of your skin. And so, again, even though it's this idea that racism is almost hidden because of this idea that people think it's a racial utopia, but when you force people to make that choice, they very often choose to distance themselves from blackness. And so that's why these activists are encouraging people to think of blackness differently. They're asking people to either check black or, if they're more comfortable, to write Afro-descendant. And the idea is that we cannot track social disparities, we cannot create policy to close these disparities if we're not figuring out who actually falls within those categories. Something else that came up through this research is the idea that if you ask people to put their skin color, instead of going by the traditional census categories, you will actually see some of those disparities come out. So one study from the University of Puerto Rico highlights that darker-skinned Puerto Ricans actually have worse health outcomes than lighter-skinned Puerto Ricans. But in surveying, they asked people to put their skin color instead of a race, and that allowed them to actually capture that disparity.
You know, it's so fascinating. And we put up the terms that people use in Puerto Rico. You know, Emery and I have talked about this. We have roots in the Caribbean as well. And I'm very intrigued by the idea of colonialism and the effect that it has had on the way people perceive themselves. Because, as you pointed out, Natasha, the colonial empires, whether they were France, England, or Spain, used those racial disparities and the ways to identify people based on the way that they appeared. In other words, the actual color of their skin, dark skin, lighter skin, almost passing, and that has now become ingrained in the way that people think. Even 200 years, for example, after the French Empire was kicked out of Haiti, for example, they still have those that mentality of thinking. And generally, people who are lighter skinned are captains of industry.
Right.
They own more businesses. They are politicians. They essentially run those islands.
What I find really interesting about this conversation, because in terms of my Caribbean background, it's Jamaican, right? And what I find very interesting is that the concept of race and everything that it means, not just the color of your skin, but all the cultural implications that is essentially sort of an American definition,
Yes.
has been exported to Puerto Rico.
Yes.
So people struggle with the idea of being both Hispanic and black.
Right.
And so they say, well, I'm not black like that definition of black.
Because they associate it with the African Americans.
Completely.
Right,
And
right.
it doesn't have to be like
right.
that, but that's sort of the power of this exported culture, Natasha.
Yeah, and that is the power of what these activists are saying, right? You can hold on to your cultural identity. You can be a proud Puerto Rican. You can play bomba music and dance and show your African heritage, and you can still be Puerto Rican. You shouldn't be forced to choose between those things. But I even think of the Super Bowl, right? We see J-Lo and Shakira, and this idea that seeing them as the face of Latinidad, of what it means to be Latino, that was normal for people. People expect a sort of white passing or a mulatto quote unquote look or mixed look to be the face of Latinidad. And these activists represent, it's a resurgence, it's a movement of people who are saying that is not necessarily the face of the Latino community, that there are many different colors, there are many different ways to identify, and they're challenging this idea that that is what we should think about when we think of Latino, that would be what a Latino looks like.
So you talked a little bit earlier about people who identify as black having poorer health outcomes. I'm wondering if there are any other sort of concrete implications, like that, whether it's relief aid or anything else that you can see that there is a negative impact when you self-identify as black.
Yeah, so the town that I chose to focus on in this New York Times story was very intentional. The town is called Loíza. It was settled by Africans who were enslaved back in the 16th century. And this town tends to have higher unemployment rates, right? It tends to be poorer. And so that's where you see that intersection of race and socioeconomic standing exposing institutional racism. One of the women who I interviewed in the story mentioned that after Hurricane Maria, even though, richer, whiter parts of Puerto Rico had electricity after the storm, they were still waiting. And so I think that, again, highlights some of the racism that gets covered up or that people feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about is you may not explicitly call me a name, right? You may not wear a Klan robe like we think of racist in the United States, but institutionally, you confine me to a certain neighborhood. You police my movement. When I go into a tourist area, police may follow you and question why you're there. And so in speaking with the ACLU of Puerto Rico, they reported cases in which black citizens, black residents felt that they were followed, that they were targeted, that they were harassed because of their skin color. And so those are concrete examples of the way people experience racism or disparities in everyday life, even without people explicitly saying, oh, it's because you're black.
Really fascinating reporting, Natasha. And I hope the New York Times and the Grio will allow you to continue to expand on this reporting, because I think you'd find that there are some commonalities, but also some differences in the Caribbean with different countries.
I'm
and
totally
different...
thinking of a conversation I had with somebody from Cuba.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. Me too.
Yeah.
And wish we had more time for that. But Natasha Alford, thank you very much for your reporting, and thanks for appearing with us.
Thanks for having me.